everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Like most of us, I'm looking forward to spring. I'm looking forward to consistently warm weather. I can smell freshly mowed lawn already. I can't wait for that.
But just even having all the sun now, it just feels so
and it's
much
higher in the sky.
Yeah.
Noticeably.
You really feel a difference.
The days are longer.
Longer days.
And so, it is coming. So I'm anxious. I really enjoy this time of year when we can start walking around, seeing how things are doing. And I love that sun getting higher in the sky.
And it's kind of nice, too, because it's helping dry out the yard a little bit that it's easier to get around and do those things. In my case, if you have to pick up after your dogs, things like that. But to get the light things that you can do to kind of get the yard in shape.
And, I think during our last podcast, I said, I didn't notice much vole damage. Well, when I did walk around, there was an area last fall that I didn't get mowed I didn't give it that last fall kind of short mowing. And that area, when I looked at that, I did see quite a bit of vole damage in that. And of course, they cause those surface channels, throughout. You can see their little winding, meandering channels. And when I took a rake, and then they loosen up the grass. So you get this big mass of fluff that rakes off. But usually it regrows from that. But anyway, that reminded me the importance of mowing a bit shorter in the fall versus the summertime mowing height.
That one final mow, give it go down a little bit
Otherwise,
more.
It gives kind of a good little hiding spot for voles to winter in.
Well, from the outside, we're going to be talking inside today. We're going to be talking about how to start new plants by taking clippings. But first, you've got a letter.
Yes, Sue wrote in, and we love the emails and email questions. So Sue writes, "The rabbits ate all the lower branches of my hydrangea shrub. How can I repair it? Or do I need just to dig and replant?" So thanks again, Sue, for writing. And so Sue sent a photo of her hydrangea shrub. It was a panicle type of hydrangea. It still had the old flower clusters on. They're decorative over winter. And the panicle type of hydrangea has the cone-shaped flowers. Instead of the big round white ones, the Annabelle type. This was the panicle type of hydrangea, fully winter hardy. Wonderful, wonderful shrubs. And the rabbits had gnawed away and consumed all the lower branches. The main trunk was still there, but it had eaten away all the little side branches. And of course, it couldn't reach the part up above. So what I suggested to Sue is in early spring, before any growth starts, so we're probably talking first part of April or so, is to give it a very hard, severe pruning. I suggested cutting it down to about 1 foot above ground level to force branching out from that lower part. Because now with these panicle type hydrangeas, there are two different growth forms. Sometimes you see them on one single stem, like a little tree. Have you ever seen those, John?
That's what they call the standards?
Yeah, standard, exactly. That's the term for it. And so it's like a rounded hydrangea shrub up on top of a single trunk. But this one was a shrub type of that. And so we need to kind of maintain that as a shrub, a well-branched shrub coming from the base, the ground level. And so that's why pruning it back to about 1 foot above. Right now, it's about 5 feet, and so that's going to be dramatic, but prune until it hurts and then prune some more. And so that will force new growth out from the lower part. And so no need to dig and replace. That hydrangea, I firmly believe, will be salvaged. The time to do it is before any new growth starts in the spring.
With pruning with hydrangeas, it's not the same across the board because some grow on old wood, some will flower on old wood, some will flower on new wood. So you don't want to cut down the old wood on the ones that
you
flower.
Got it. And that's a common question with hydrangeas because there are two well-adapted classes of hydrangeas. The Annabelle type, we kind of call, there are different cultivars, but they're all kind of called the Annabelle type. Those are the ones with a great big round white flower clusters.
Yeah, big snowball tops.
Yep. And they all die back to just a little above ground level. each winter. That's just what they do. And so in early spring, before new growth starts, you prune those back every year down to maybe a foot or so, 6 inches above ground level. They come back, bloom beautifully on that new wood that is produced. The other type, as you mentioned, these paniculata types with the cone-shaped flowers, they perform like what I call ordinary shrubs. They don't freeze back like that, so you're not pruning back each year to near ground level. They perform like an ordinary shrub where they leaf out from all the above ground portions. So the branches up above produce new leaves. So at most, those you do a little trimming, cut off the old flower heads that are oftentimes still there in the spring, and you treat that type, the panicle type of hydrangea, you treat those like an ordinary shrub where you don't each year cut them all the way down.
So if she does prune back this year, do you think she'll still see the same amount of flowers this year?
Probably not.
Okay.
Because that type blooms on, both new and old wood. Like you mentioned, the old wood, the growth that comes from the previous season. So it's going to take a little while for that to kind of get back into blooming. It'll probably take a season or two, but it'll come.
But it can be salvaged.
Gardening teaches us patience, but it can be salvaged.
Well, that's great. So if people have a question for you, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, send me an email. Photos are always great on issues. And send me an email. And not only if you have an issue, but when something goes right. It's fun to share that too. So email is donald.kinsler, Kinzler, donald.kinsler@ndsu.edu.
Well, and I'm sure another question, you said you always get questions about that, about hydrangeas and when to prune back, which ones to prune back. But I'm sure you also get a lot of questions on how to start new houseplants.
Yes, and right now is a good time because there isn't a whole lot we can do outside yet. Pretty soon we can do some pruning and different things, and pretty soon we'll be able to get out into the lawn. But in the meantime, this is a really good time to start some new houseplants. And one reason for that is because the days are longer now. And of course, houseplants react to that. The light coming through the window, the houseplants know that the days are longer now. And so they'll send out extra growth. They're getting their spring growth on. And it's a good time while we're waiting to do things outside to start some more. And of course, one of the keys to enjoying houseplants is enjoying more of them. So it's fun to propagate houseplants, and I enjoy houseplants because that kind of satisfies my sweet tooth for plants during the winter time.
Yep.
And so I've usually got houseplant cuttings going. Now, when I was a boy, my mom rooted most of her houseplants in water. She'd take they always called them slips. She'd take a cutting off of her houseplants and root them in a glass of water. And that works. But there is actually a way to get a little nicer root system on those cuttings. And so anyway, before we get outside, let's give our houseplants some attention. So back to why houseplant cuttings do better not in water, but in another. Okay. Instead of rooting them in water, research has shown that you'll get a better rooted cutting, a more fibrous, fuller root, if you root them in a solid media of some sort. So a potting mix or vermiculite. Are you familiar with vermiculite, John? Have you ever worked that?
The little beads?
Little, the vermiculite are the little golden flecks.
Flecks, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And perlite is another good material. Perlite are the little round beads, white. Or you can use a really good high quality potting mix. But when you root cuttings in that kind of a more solid type mix instead of water, those roots that form are more fibrous, well branched, not so straggly. And also, roots that form in water are adapted to water. And when you go to transplant them into a potting mix, there's more of a transition, more of a shock. Whereas if those roots form in a solid type mix and then you go to pot them up into potting mix, they're already accustomed to growing in that. So there's less shock. But now that doesn't mean, nothing against the way my mom did it. She was a good gardener and that worked. But, sometimes we can improve on things. And so that's why a person recommends the thing we're going to talk about here, the process. And when I first became familiar with the process that we're going to describe, and it's called houseplant cuttings in a bucket, for lack of a classier term. But I first became familiar with this in Horticulture 201 lab about 50 some years ago, I suppose. And it was the introduction to horticulture, and there was a lab. And one of the first sessions was we were going to take houseplant cuttings. And each of us got an old ice cream bucket, and we'll do the process we'll describe in a minute. And I thought, wow, these are cuttings better than Mom used to make. And so I've been doing that process ever since. So I suppose first we should maybe mention, okay, what types of houseplants can be propagated from cuttings? Okay. Basically, the types that you can start from cuttings are those that produce stems and leaves, leaves along stems. If all of the growth originates from one crown at ground level, well, then there's nothing really to take cuttings of. For example, peace lily.
Okay.
That's gotten the reputation for being a funeral plant. Mm-hmm. And they're beautiful. They're good memories of people. But the peace lily, all the leaves originate from one central crown. So there's no stems really to take cuttings from. And so that type of plant we can divide. You pop it out of its pot, take a sharp knife or saw, cut down through that crown, and where you had one plant, maybe you've got 4 plants. So some plants like that are divided instead of propagated by cuttings. So if you take a look at your houseplant, and if it has leaves growing along stems where you can nip off the outer perimeter of stems plus leaves, those are the ones that you can do cuttings from. Another example of a division would be fern. Ferns like Boston fern all arise out of one central crown, and so those are divided as opposed to taking cuttings. Some types of plants are kind of nifty in that all you need is a leaf. Like an African violet.
Okay, sure.
African violet, you can just take off a leaf plus a little bit of the leaf stem called the petiole and put that stem end down in a little bit of mix. Again, a mix works better than in water, less rotting. And you can produce a whole new little African violet off of that one leaf and its little bit of stem. Jade plants. You can do that. You can take off the kind of succulent type, and other succulents as well. You can take a little chunk of that, like a leaf or a kind of and then just put the kind of the open end, the part that was attached, stick that down in the soil.
Yeah, you really don't have to. You don't have to. You don't have to bury those. You don't have to dig at all for especially jade plants. You almost just lay it down right on top of the soil.
You got it, John. And what's kind of fun is occasionally a leaf will drop. And then you'll say, oh, gosh, here's a baby plant coming because that leaf landed just right and touched the surface with that kind of cut end. And there you got a new little baby plant popping up from that. So that's fun as well. It's
a great thing to do with kids, too, to show kids about growing and about taking care of plants, but just kind of how easy, there's not a big process to those ones that we just talked about.
It is because, what is so magical about getting a cutting to root. Okay, so you take this piece off of a plant, a stem with some leaves, put that down in this mix, give it some time, and dig it up out of the mix, and it's got all these beautiful roots. So it's kind of like, pulling a rabbit out of a hat, so to show kids this, the magic of nature, this is one of the things, and it is such a kid-friendly method too, that we're going to describe. In fact, in May, I'm probably going to do this with a group of Area 4-H kids and show them how to do this process as well.
And you said that some of the other ones, some of the common ones that you do in the house over the coleus. There was a couple of other ones that you do that are easy to do this within the house.
Yeah, pothos, ivies, a lot of the kind of vining type things work well. Jade plant, even though you can take just one of the leaves and stick that down and get a little jade plant to pop up, if you actually take a stem cutting from the outer tips of the plant, a stem cutting meaning a portion of the stem and maybe that's got 4 leaves attached, that will produce a faster little plant than just the single leaf, which works too, but you can get a little better plant. So almost any plant that has a stem with leaves coming off of that will make a cutting from which you can get roots to.
Just talking about jade plant, I think I'm thinking of like the shape and the size and the texture of the leaf, for lack of a better term. But does that process also work with something like Christmas cactus?
Yes.
Easter just having that little.
Yep, they're called stem pads.
Stem pad.
Yep, so
yeah,
and that's one way that's awesome because great grandmother's Christmas cactus can be had by all the relatives by taking these stem sections, and on those they're kind of divided into those little sections. Like you take a stem cutting that maybe has about 3 or 4 of those pads and get that to root down. And so the neat thing about that is when a cutting is taken from great-grandmother's cactus and produces roots, that is great-grandmother's cactus. It has been cloned. It's not like saving seed from it and then seed is variable. So, but that is great-grandmother's cactus. It's genetically the same, such as if we took your finger and cloned you, John, we'd have an exact clone of John. And so I just find that fascinating, that especially for these heritage-type plants. And occasionally when someone will pass away that has had one of these heritage plants, maybe great-grandmother got it from her mother, and this plant has been in the family. And then the next person that inherits that, I oftentimes get emails from people saying, I just inherited my aunt's, and this is a really old 100. I'm just afraid I don't want it to die on my watch here. What do I do? The first thing I suggest is propagate it. Take cuttings. Take a dozen cuttings. You share them with the cousins, and because then there you have all these multiples that are her plant, her heritage plant. So I always recommend. So there are good cases with heritage plants to get these cuttings going in case something happens to the original one.
All right, well, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the process of how to do these cuttings and how to get these cuttings growing.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back and we're talking about taking leaf cuttings and starting new plants from old household plants. And Don, you've got a tried and true method that you've been using for years.
Yeah, I've been working about 50 years, so it's got a decent track record. And so I was so happy that I was taught this method. So it's so fun to pass it along. So what we need is an ice cream type bucket. And so they're 4 or 5 quarts. Now, if you don't need enough ice cream to have an ice cream bucket, you can get a similar size. I found them like at farm supplies stores in the paint section.
Okay, sure.
In the paint section, they'll have these little plastic buckets. A handle is nice on that. And then what a person does is with that plastic bucket, make sure that you drill holes in. It doesn't have to be a clear bucket. It can be a solid color bucket because it's going to get light from up on top.
Okay.
So the sides don't have to be clear. Okay. So, but make sure that you drill or poke 6 holes or so in because we need to make sure that any excess water can drain out of it. Okay. Then the next thing we need is a clear plastic bag that's large enough for this ice cream bucket to fit into, so that you can set the bucket down in, pull the plastic up around it, because that plastic will catch any water that does pass through. It'll act kind of as a drainage tray. But then we also need to pull it up to make kind of a greenhouse over the top of this bucket.
You want some height to it.
Exactly. And to be able to fasten it up on top so it can't fit too tightly onto the bucket.
So we're not talking about like just garbage, or not garbage bags, but grocery bags, something like this.
Exactly.
We're talking something.
It's got to be clear.
Got to be clear, and it's
what we're
got to
doing,
be a bit longer, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
What we're doing is we're creating a miniature greenhouse. So clear. A little clear greenhouse in which these cuttings are going to enjoy high humidity and the perfect conditions. They're going to get light from above through the clear plastic bag. So we're forming a little miniature greenhouse in which these houseplants, most of which are tropical, are going to just love that humidity, and they are going to root well for us. Okay, so we need the ice cream bucket or similar, clear plastic bag, big enough to enclose this whole thing. And then next, we need the media that I talked about. Okay, there's some flexibility. You could use straight vermiculite, and you can get these at garden centers. The vermiculite are the little golden flakes, and that works well just straight. Or you can use perlite, the little white beads, or you can use a high-quality potting mix. If you're going to use a potting mix, I would also buy a bag of, and these are available in fairly small bags, okay? And I would combine, if you're going to use potting mix, I would combine about half that and then half either vermiculite or perlite. What those two do, vermiculite or perlite, they open up the mix so that it gets good air and yet they hold moisture. Okay. So good drainage, but then they also hold moisture. Potting mix by itself could be a little bit too, moisture laden, and things could rot more in that. So that's why I would go either straight vermiculite, straight perlite, or half of one of those and half potting mix would work very, very well. Okay. So those are the materials that are needed. And then also we're going to need, of course, the houseplant cuttings to go in. And so when you're looking at your houseplant that you want to take cuttings from, take the cuttings from the outer perimeter. The tip cuttings will root better than the older interior cuttings. So the nice tips that have that outer growing point, and each cutting should be 3 to 4 inches long. And so when you snip with a scissors or a shears, snip off those tip cuttings, remove the lower several leaves from that. And when you remove those leaves from along the stem, along that stem, there will be those little raised sections where the leaves were attached. Those are called the nodes. Okay. And on most cuttings, that's where the roots will arise. So any leaves that would be below the media, we're going to poke these cuttings into our media, any leaves that would be below that point should be removed. Okay. And then that's where the roots are going to come out of.
Just out of curiosity, how many nodes then would you want into the media?
Yeah, at least a couple. Okay. Yeah, at least a couple. So again, we aren't looking at a real huge, great big, long, unwieldy cutting, but probably a 3 to 4 inch long cutting, and with a number of leaves on it. A number of leaves being 3 or 4 leaves, and removed. You've already removed the lower couple of leaves that are going to go below. So a couple of empty nodes, leafless nodes down below this mix. Okay, if I've described that well. Okay, and each of these cutting buckets can hold, depending on the size of the cuttings and kind of how far the leaves spread out, you could probably get 6, 8, maybe even 10 cuttings in a bucket. And so, any questions, John, on the materials?
No, but it sounds like having
painted the picture okay
having
on
that
the
many
material
in a bucket. I mean, it sounds like you're starting your own kind of new planter.
Yes, exactly.
Like you think about it as you're putting a planter outside.
Yeah, when we're finished with this, it's actually kind of a neat little planter. Okay, with assorted plant types. And so now, that's a good question too. Off of one houseplant, you're probably going to get many cuttings. So I suppose you could fill the bucket with all one type. But what I usually do is, since I'd like another one of this and another one of that, I'll usually have 6 or 8 different types of plants. One thing I have to rein myself in on, okay, our older jade plant could probably give me 20 cuttings. Well, I probably shouldn't have another 20 jade plants growing. And so sometimes I try to say, okay, well, gosh, I'd like another 1 or 2 of this and that. And so, sometimes we need to resist the urge to to populate our house with a huge unwieldy quantity of plants. But anyway, okay. So the next is, let's talk about the media. Okay, I suggested perlite, vermiculite, potting mix, using half and half. Okay, those are usually very dry. Right out of the bag, they're very dry. So before we use them, we need to moisten them. So one way you can do is just put the material from the bag into your bucket that you've already drilled the holes in. You can put it into the bucket and then water it. Okay, we haven't put the cuttings in yet, okay? But water that mix it around with your hands, and get it nice and moist. Otherwise, they're just so powder dry and dusty and hard to work with. Or you can add the water to the bag of vermiculite or perlite and stir that around good. But I prefer just to wet the amount that I'm actually going to use. Sometimes I'll wet these materials the day before, so that they have a little chance to absorb the material, the moisture, and that works well. Okay, so we've got that moistened. We've got it in the bucket. And don't fill the bucket up all the way, but maybe a half to 2/3 of the depth of the bucket. We need to leave a little room at the top for our cuttings. And so next we're ready to put those cuttings into the mix. So we remove the lower couple of leaves. So we've got some bare nodes, those raised parts along the stem, so that we put those down in. Now, what about rooting powders? At garden centers, you can get rooting hormones that help, and they do help encourage rooting along stems. So that's always a good idea. Most of them are powders. You maybe on a paper towel shake out a little bit of out of the container. It's best not to dip the cutting into the jar of rooting powder, because then you've contaminated that powder with possible fungi and bacteria. Okay, so it's better to shake a little of that out of the container onto a paper towel and then roll the cutting, the part that's going to go down into the mix with a couple of nodes, roll that in the powder. Sometimes it helps to moisten the cuttings a little bit so that rooting powder sticks to them, but leave the container uncontaminated. Okay. And so then, if you've used rooting powder, use a pencil to make a hole down in your media into the mix. Use a pencil and then insert the cutting into that. If you just kind of jab the cutting down in to the mix, it might wear off the rooting powder that you've put on the sides. And so make a hole with a pencil, insert the cutting, and then firm the mix, the media around that cutting. So now when you've inserted these cuttings, with your hands, kind of pack the media around the cuttings so they don't wiggle. If cuttings are left to wiggle, it can wear off the roots as they're trying to form. And so then even though we have pre-moistened the media, after you've inserted your 6 to 8 or 10 cuttings, water it with a nice gentle water stream. I usually take it over the kitchen sink and kind of that rinsing attachment. I'll water it.
Give it a little
really
shower.
Good. Yep, exactly. So moisten that mix again. What that does is firms the media around the cutting and making sure that then your media is well moistened. And then any excess will drain out the holes. Then the next step is to put that, the whole bucket and works into your plastic bag. Now, the cuttings, when you situate them, they're probably going to be standing up out of the bucket a little bit. We filled the bucket, half or 2/3 full. And so the cuttings will usually be sticking up above the edges a little bit. But our clear plastic bag is big enough so we can set the plastic bag. We can set the bucket into the plastic bag, kind of bring the plastic bag up, and then loosely fasten the top. When I say loosely, we want to create a nice humid atmosphere, but we don't want to exclude oxygen.
So you don't want to do anything like tie it off, and you don't want to put a clip on it or anything like that.
Right.
Maybe just kind of like
we don't want to
it.
make it like a balloon that holds air. We need a little
so just
air
maybe
exchange.
Kind of roll it together.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Now, sometimes I'll use an old twist-em and twist it just such that there's still a little bit of an air hole visible. An alternative, if you used a rubber band or something, you could poke some pencil holes in the bag also. And then the next step is to give it some light. Those cuttings need light to grow. So in a window, a little bit of sun is good, but we don't want to cook it by putting it in a full sunny south window. So when I use our south window, I put it off to the side a little bit. So as the sun angles in, it'll maybe get a little bit of sunshine and warmth, but yet it's not sitting in there in full sun all day long. And so kind of a little bit of an indirect light on that. But they'll root better if they are getting maybe a little bit of sunlight on that. And then with the humidity, pretty soon it's like a little rainforest in there. You'll get some condensation on the plastic, and then it kind of rains down on them. And so it's almost self-sustaining water-wise until they're rooted. But do check it every once in a while. Open it up. Feel the mix down there. If it feels dry, then of course give it another shower. But usually it will become its own little rainforest. And you usually will not have to water it until these are rooted. So how long does it take? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe even up to 4 weeks before you've got good roots. Well, what are good roots? When the roots have formed and are maybe 2-3 inches long, then it would be ready to be potted up. Each cutting would be ready to be potted up into its own little individual houseplant pot. Well, how do we know what's going on down there? How do we know if they're rooting or not? Well, resist the urge. I have a hard time resisting this. Resist the urge to grab the cutting and pull up to see what's going on down there, because those little tender roots, they could just break off. So when I can't resist seeing what's happening, with my fingers, I'll dig down into the mix and lift it up. And so that any roots that are forming will gently come up out of the mix. And then if it looks like, they aren't quite ready yet, it's always amazing when they've started producing roots. But if they aren't long enough, then I just gently replant them down into the mix, and then they'll continue on. But at a certain point, I would say, after 2 weeks, a person really should lift them up lift them up to see what they're doing.
Okay.
So a couple of things that are important. Of course, the media has to be moist. They've got to be getting some light. But the other thing that really helps is some warmth. And that's why I like it in a window that gets a little bit of sunlight, because that will warm up that little greenhouse. The sunlight coming through will warm it up a little bit. But make sure you've put the whole little bucket greenhouse in a warm spot, because that warmth does really help. If I put it in kind of a chilly window, I've noticed it can take a lot longer to actually produce roots. A heating pad could be used, of the germination heating pads, that we use for seedlings.
Yep.
You could place it on that as well.
I suppose with something like that, you really don't want to, if you have to move it, you don't want to have to pick it up by the top, probably, do you? I mean, because there will be a certain amount of weight in there because of the media and
exactly.
So you really want to kind of be careful if you have to move it as opposed to pick it up by the base. You got it,
because I'm always a good test subject for all this stuff, because I've made every mistake. So I've picked it up by the top. I've grabbed the plastic and lifted the whole thing up, and I've jostled some cuttings, because where the plastic kind of then jostled and moved around, then I've thought, oh shoot, I dislodged some cuttings. So you're absolutely right, John. Now I've learned to kind of lift it up by the sides or the bottom when I need to move it, because sometimes you do. If you need to re-wet or moisten, and you need to take it back to the kitchen sink. And so, you've hit on one of the mistakes I made is just grabbing it and lifting it by the top.
When we're making those cuttings, those first cuttings off the healthy plant to get your cuttings to start another plant, do you want to cut like at an angle, or is it fine just to cut a straight 90-degree, for lack of a better term?
It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, just straight across is fine.
Okay. I was thinking of like when we cut flowers, when you have cut flowers, you want them at an angle, thinking that maybe they take up more, but then that way they're actually in water and not in the media.
I think, John, as I kind of think about that a little, I think the cutting on a slant is probably the preferred.
Okay.
And the reason why that is because I mentioned how the roots come out of the nodes, but also the rooting powders, when you use that, will stimulate roots from kind of other areas and not just the nodes. And one of those areas that it can stimulate rooting from is that cut surface. And if you cut it at an angle, there will be more surface area there for roots to come out of versus straight across. So although I've got to admit that sometimes I may be in a hurry, just cut straight across, if I'm pondering it a little bit, I think I would cut on a slant.
Okay.
Yeah, good point.
All right. And then so once you've got you test your, you said to be cautious when you're testing to the roots to make sure that they're set. But once if you put the fork in and you realize that they're coming along pretty good, what's the next step? Because do we just keep them in that ice cream bucket for how long? When do we move them?
Yep, really, when you've checked, and you almost do have to at a certain point check. So somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks, I would definitely check. And I heard you say fork. Even though I dig my hands down and get my fingers down in and lift the cuttings up, a person could use a fork to get down into the soil mix and lift the cutting up, instead of just grabbing the top of the cutting and pulling upward. But at the 2 to 3 week point, a person really should be lifting a few cuttings up to see what they're doing. And when when the roots have reached that 2 to 3 inch length, then they really need to get out of the bucket and into the pot, into a separate pot. Otherwise, if we left them in there too long, they're kind of pretty in there. They make that combination planter that you mentioned. But if we left them in there too long, the roots would get intertwined. Each cutting would have the roots intertwined, and it would be a little harder to tease them apart without damaging. You also bring up the good point about when it is time to take the cuttings out of the bucket and give them their own pot. We shouldn't put them in too large of a pot too soon. Sometimes it's tempting to think, well, gosh, this little cutting is going to make a big plant someday. Why don't I just start in a big pot and I won't have to repot? But new cuttings can wallow in too much soil, and it leads to overwatering and etc. So a new little plant coming out of the bucket should go probably somewhere in a pot that's 3 to 4 inches in top diameter. 3 to 4 inch pot is where you would usually start a new little rooted cutting into. That'll be just about perfect. And they could probably grow in there for 6-8 months, maybe even a year if it's a slower growing type. And then after a year, you'd be ready to bump it up from that 3 to 4 inch diameter pot up to probably a 6 inch or 8 inch pot.
All right.
So on it starts the process.
So you've been using this process for 50 years. How many times a year do you think that you take cuttings and use this process?
I usually do it in the spring.
Okay.
Plants can tell the depths of winter. I mean, you could certainly take cuttings in the middle of winter. Some extra plant lights would probably help stimulate growth. But it seems like this time of year when our days are getting longer and light levels get a little, it just seems that it's a natural time for houseplants to want to grow. And so when I say want to grow, produce new growth. And so I just feel like the rooting is better. It seems like plants know that now is the time to get going. And when you remove the cutting from the mother plant, it seems like that new cutting seems to know, gosh, I need to produce some roots. And now is a good time to do it.
And I suppose if you do it now and then you get the new plant established that within 3 weeks to a month, or 2 to 3 weeks to a month, get it in its own pot, then you really have like those kind of high voltage summer days where they're going to get a lot of sun. They're going to be in their own space. They will grow faster, and it gets them kind of prepared for fall. So what I'm saying is you're going to have, it sounds like you're going to have more success doing this at this time of the year versus if you could certainly do it anytime, but if you do it later summer when the days are getting shorter, you're not going to have that energy.
The dull days of November just seems like they aren't as conducive to new growth. And you bring up another good point, John, and that is, okay, we've taken cuttings off, and maybe the mother plant is starting to get not so hot looking, as we've taken cuttings from the outer perimeter. But this is a good time, too, to cut some of these plants back quite severely, repot them, and maybe even give them a summer vacation outside. And then even that mother plant can start lots of good new growth, kind of a fresh start, if they've gotten kind of leggy and older looking. So, yeah, it's amazing what we can do with plants.
It is great. Then that's just kind of great to give people something to do now. Like I said,
we're kind of biding our time until we can get outside.
People are probably itching to get out in the yard, and it's not quite there.
Let's do our houseplants.
Well, that's great. Well, John, if people have any questions for you about this process or anything in general, if they have any gardening questions, what's the best way to reach you?
Best way to reach is email me, donald.kinsler, Kinzler, at ndsu.edu. And a year or so ago, I actually wrote a forum communications garden column about this. And so I have found that you can just do an online search, houseplant cuttings in forum, growing together, and you can actually find the photos of this process online.
Excellent. Well, Don, thanks again. This has been great, and it kind of makes me want to go home and try to find a plant that I should be doing that with.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for listening.